Just give me a
G'day,
second
mate.
here.
Luke Forward here with Kevin Michael Grace, and welcome to the book club. Today's book is Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered by E.F. Schumacher, and has a lot of glowing reviews on Amazon.com. It's a book that came out in 1973. Small is Beautiful is Oxford-trained economist E.F. Schumacher's classic call for the end of excessive consumption. Schumacher inspired such movements as buy locally and fair trade, while voicing strong opposition to casino capitalism and wasteful corporate behemoths. Named one of the Times Literary Supplement's 100 most influential books since World War II, Small is Beautiful presents eminently logical arguments for building our economies around the needs of communities, not corporations. His perspective is informed by Gandhian and Buddhist and Roman Catholic concepts of scale and Catholic understandings of distributionist economics. And he runs directly against the bigger is better philosophy of mainstream economics that argues in favor of increasing scale till marginal costs begin to rise. Schumacher goes against the idea that profits per se are the only goal. And Kevin Michael Grace, if you could go ahead and unmute and talk to us about why you chose this book.
Well, I chose this book because it presents an alternative view, a radically alternative view to the way that we live now and to the way, more important, the way that we think now. Because the way we live now is the result of the way we think. Now, his book, Small is Beautiful, became an unlikely bestseller. It was translated into dozens of languages and sold millions of copies. And he was invited to the White House by Jimmy Carter, and he became a celebrity. I'll just read from the epilogue to give you an idea of what this book is about and what its presupposition is. In the excitement over the unfolding of his scientific and technical powers, modern man has built a system of production that ravages nature and a type of society that mutilates man. If only there were more and more wealth, everything else that is thought would fall into place. Money is considered to be all-powerful. If it could not actually buy non-material values such as justice, harmony, beauty, or even health, it could circumvent the need for them or compensate for their loss. The development of production and the acquisition of wealth have thus become the highest goals of the modern world, in relation to which all other goals, no matter how much lip service may still be paid to them, have come to take second place. The highest goals require no justification. All secondary goals have finally to justify themselves in terms of the service their attainment renders to the attainment of the highest. This is the philosophy of materialism, which he claims is now being challenged by events. Now, I will point out that a great many people at the time, the economists mostly, and of course Schumacher was himself economist, claimed that the problems that he forecast for large-scale capitalism would not come about because, something will come up, as they like to say, that we'll figure out these. One of the predictions that he made was that the scale economy would lead to a crisis of resources. And we saw this very clearly in the 2007-2008 economic debacle, which nearly destroyed the economy of the world. He pointed out that the modern economy and the idea that we get richer and richer every year is based on the exploitation of resources, natural resources, particularly oil. And as we have seen, oil now represents a critical threat or bottleneck, as he would say, as Schumacher would say, to our future prosperity. As James Kunstler puts it, all our economic success of recent years, or the growth of the economy, has been based on cheap oil. When oil ceases to be cheap, the economy is in trouble, or as he puts it, when oil is under $75 a barrel, the oil industry begins to die. When oil rises above $75 a barrel, the economy begins to die. This is the paradox in which we are trapped. He deploys statistics to demonstrate that this idea that the rest of the world would become as well off as the United States was unsustainable, because the United States devours an enormous amount of the resources of the entire world.
Yeah.
Now, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, the United States dominates the world. I mean, not as much as they did in the 1950s, when in the 1950s, the United States produced about 80% of all goods in the world. I mean, the United States economy in the 1950s was as big as all other economies put together. So the dominance is not as large as it was in the 1950s, but the United States is still the economic behemoth. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I mean, it's less and less an economic behemoth, well, particularly with the rise of China and India. The essence of the book can be summarized in one sentence: the substance of man cannot be measured by gross national product. And he continues, perhaps it cannot be measured at all except for certain symptoms of loss. However, this is not the place to go into the statistics of these symptoms, such as crime, drug addiction, vandalism, mental breakdown, rebellion, and so forth. Statistics never prove anything. Now, as I mentioned, Schumacher was an economist, but his great revelation was that economics has presuppositions. And foremost of those presuppositions is that material wealth, material goods are the only things which are essential. That material goods can be measured, and thus we should devote our energies to making more of the things which can be measured. Now, he talks about, he spent time in Burma, and he noticed that, well, in the West, they were talking about planning for leisure. In Burma, they seem to have dealt with this problem already. This suggestion, of course, that we live in a leisure economy would seem to be belied by the constant claims of nearly everyone that they are run off their feet, that they have no time, that they never have enough time. He says that I started by saying that one of the most fateful errors of our age is the belief that the problem of production has been solved. This illusion, I suggested, is mainly due to our inability to recognize that the modern industrial system, with all of its intellectual sophistication, consumes the very basis on which it has been erected. To use the language of the economist, it lives on irreplaceable capital, which it cheerfully treats as income. I specified 3 categories of such capital: fossil fuels, the tolerance margins of nature, and the human substance. Now, I wanted to ask you from the beginning, people would be interested in this book if they believed that we had arrived at a critical problem of existence. Do you believe that's true or not?
No, not currently.
Okay.
But I'm open to the idea. I'm not closed to the idea. I wouldn't say definitively not true, but I'm open to what you're saying.
Okay, well, he mentioned crime, drug addiction, vandalism, mental breakdown, rebellion, sorry, and so forth. But of course, we have this tremendous problem of obesity now, which did not exist in Schumacher's time. And it's fascinating to consider the problem of obesity with regard to the problems of materialism and technology that Schumacher identifies. One can blame obesity on an anomy in people, that they eat because their lives are aimless, or they eat because they are greedy. But there's another specific problem, which is derives from technology, that food scientists, as they are called, are now designing food with the use of corn syrup, and carbohydrates, processed carbohydrates, in order to be addictive. The idea being is, the old ad, you just can't eat one chip, right? The Pringles.
Right.
Food scientists now design food so that a lot of people find it difficult to stop eating ever. And so we see here the two of the problems that Schumacher has identified. This assumption that that technology is a pure good, and that we should do things because we can, and also the aimlessness, the anomy produced by our way of living. There's a backronym which has been devised to describe scale: size, complexity, atomization, liberalism, and elitism. Now, Schumacher did not design this backronym, but you see all of the qualities contained in it are implicit or even explicit in Schumacher's critique. That, for instance, liberalism, well, the ever-growing complexity of modern life, as expressed, say, in multiculturalism, results in a situation where we are ordered to ignore certain facts about our lives, because the fear is that if people started noticing unpleasant things, then society would break down completely. For instance, the reason why there is a semi-official ban on racial discussion is because of the fear that actual race war would break out if such facts were discussed openly. Now, I know that you don't seem to have a problem with materialism or even with greed. One of the things that Schumacher discusses right at the beginning of his book is this idea, this materialist assumption, which is held by almost all the economists, that people becoming richer is good, and that one of the reasons for this is that rich people won't start wars. Well, Germany was the richest country in the world in both 1914 and 1939. I won't get into the question of Germany's war guilt in the First World War, but its war guilt in the Second World War is unassailable. And if rich countries don't start wars, how do you explain Germany, or, more to the point, or more to the present time, how do you explain that the United States, which is in many ways the richest country on earth, seems to be addicted to starting wars all over the world? And apparently, to my amazement, there is now this talk of a war over Montenegro, which is a place in the Balkans that I would reckon that fewer than 100 of one out of 100 Americans have even heard of. Do you accept this notion that rich people are less likely to start wars?
No, not at all. And I think we'll get even more clarity on that from next week's book by John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. People engage in war because it's an extension of politics by other means, because there are all sorts of factors that cause people to have to take up arms, and absolutely not. Wealth does not reduce the chances of war. And for example, Germany and England were each other's major trading partners prior to World War I. So I agree with you there.
Now, Schumacher discusses the major presupposition of economists, and this belief that certain activities can be branded economic or uneconomic. And he begins by quoting John Maynard Keynes, that avarice and usury and precaution must be our gods for a little longer still. and that Keynes thought, that the glorious future was coming, but in the meantime, we were going to have this nastiness and dishonesty before. He writes that if an activity has been branded as uneconomic, its right to existence is not merely questioned, but energetically denied. Anything that is found to be an impediment to economic growth is a shameful thing, and if people cling to it, they are thought of as either saboteurs or fools. Call a thing immoral or ugly, soul-destroying, or a degradation of man, a peril to the peace of the world or to the well-being of future generations. As long as you've not shown it to be uneconomic, you have not really questioned its right to exist, grow, and prosper. Now, you could look at family formation in the United States and in the West. The total female replacement falling below the equilibrium of 2.05. Some places like Japan as low as 1.4. Now, the family is, in a materialist sense, uneconomic, because we are told by the globalists, by almost all of our leaders in the West, that it is not necessary for us to have children. It is not necessary for us to replace ourselves, because we can simply import people from foreign countries. Now, this seems a shocking suggestion to me, but what is more shocking is that it is the majority opinion, the only opinion amongst the elite. The problems of the mass importation of people from foreign countries, particularly non-European countries, is one that the economists don't seem to care about. I mean, they don't seem to care because of their belief that human beings are essentially interchangeable. And in any event, when these foreigners, whether they be from, Indonesia or Ghana or Pakistan, or when all of our material benefits and our media and our various forms of socialization or the lack of it, well, they'll be transformed by what some people refer to as our magic dirt, that they will lose their essentials. Now, wouldn't you agree that this is an example where the materialist preoccupation of the economics profession has led to a situation which could be described as disastrous?
I'm open to that point of view. I have various points on the book, but I don't want to interrupt your flow if you've got further points that you'd like to make.
No, I have lots and lots of points, but I don't want to hog this discussion, so you go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to make about 6 points rapid fire, and then you can either choose one to respond to, or I will choose one for you. So let me just run through all my points, and then we'll discuss them. So point number one, Schumacher is essentially complaining about economics getting out of its lane. So on all my YouTube channels, I've got the slogan, stay in your lane. And so even Schumacher would say that to in a certain context, economics, traditional economics, is highly useful. But economics, as he points out, is a subset of a certain type of political thinking. And when economics is made the great God, then you get all sorts of horrible consequences. So I think that's accurate. So all specialties, from economics to psychology to plumbing, they all have their place. But when a specialty gets out of its lane, then it can be destructive. So context is everything. For example, I don't blame the invention of the World Wide Web for people to get addicted to internet pornography. I don't blame cell phones for killing people because many people who are driving on the road are illegally on their cell phones while they're driving, and they're getting distracted and they're killing people. But I don't blame the cell phones, and I don't blame the internet. I blame the individuals who misuse these technologies, and I blame societies that misuse economics. As for the bigger question, the question of small versus big, to me, it's a matter of context. Sometimes big is better, sometimes small is better. I used to work 60 hours a week for about 2.5 years to maximize my income in a sustainable way. There were jobs that I could do in a way where I wasn't going to get sick, where the work was reasonably interesting, and I maximized my income to pay off my debt. And then I switched to 30 hours a week after I paid off all my debt so that I could spend my time in other endeavors. So I essentially halved my income because I wanted more spare time. So in certain contexts, working 60 hours a week was right for me. And then in the new context of being debt free, switching to 30 hours a week was better suited. So people who convert to a religion in adulthood tend to make it the primary way they see life. People raised in a religion tend to place religion in its place. It's one aspect of life. There's the religious sphere of life. E.F. Schumacher converted to Roman Catholicism around 1970, and he certainly, even in the years leading up to that, he was certainly on a path, a spiritual journey. And so I think that spiritual journey became the dominant lens through which he viewed the world. And I wonder if he would have written this book if instead he'd always been raised in Catholicism and didn't have the convert's enthusiasm. I'm curious, which countries would Schumacher see as models? He mentions Burma, but I don't think very many people in the Western world would see Burma as a model for how they would want their society structured. So let's look at something like food addiction, which you mentioned. Food scientists have an incentive to create people to get addicted to food. So do we view food addiction as primarily the result of our economic system, or do we view it as primarily a result of a spiritual problem, or do we look at it primarily as a symptom of a lack of human connection? My vote would be on 2 and 3. As for atomization, I live in Orthodox Judaism, and Orthodox Jews have no problem with atomization. Orthodox Jews know connection, live connection, feel connection, and no matter economic scale, they have connection because that's part of their way of life. Also, I was raised intensely in the Seventh-day Adventist Church before I converted to Judaism. Once again, no matter the economy, no matter the economic system, the Seventh-day Adventists that I grew up with were strongly connected to other people, did not feel atomized and lost in a big society. I agree with you, once again, that wealth has nothing to do with whether or not a country will go to war. And then what about having children? Are children uneconomic? I would say in certain circumstances, children are uneconomic. For example, if you're in a concentration camp, children are a bad idea. Also, some countries are overcrowded. And so it would rationally make sense for Japan, for example, to want to reduce its population by 10, 20 million. Japan will become a much more beautiful, harmonious, just a richer, more prosperous place if it reduces its population by 10 to 20 million. Even if its total GDP goes down, its per capita GDP will go up, but the country will certainly function better. I don't think the United States is a better country because it has 300 million people. I think the United States would be better off with certainly half that many. China also has a population problem. And so in certain circumstances, I think it makes sense for countries to want to limit the number of children that are being produced, but to replace, to encourage your native, your historic nation to stop having kids so that they can be replaced by foreigners is just suicide. So is there any particular point there that you would like to weigh in on, or shall I raise something to you?
No, I'm going to say that you seem to have this obsession with there being one model, one economic model for the world. This just leads to war. It leads to destruction. That we've seen this from the 1990s onward. This insistence by the neoliberals and the neoconservatives that alternative economic models cannot be allowed to exist. That the French better get down with McDonald's. That they better get down with understanding the economies of scale and their stupid habit of wasting time over lunch with their cafes. Well, we're going to teach them that the way that you properly have lunch is to stand in line, to get a bag full of food, to shove it down your gullet, and be back in your car in 10 minutes. I just, this idea of there being one model, and of course, we being in a position to instruct the rest of the world how they should live, I have no time for that. I'll also mention, you described Schumacher's conversion rather dismissively. He was raised in a Lutheran family. He was attracted to Marxism as a young man, like many of his generation. He came to Catholicism very slowly over a period of decades, and he read the Catholic literature in great depth. Why are you so dismissive?
I don't think I was dismissive in the least. I simply pointed out that converts, and I'm speaking as a convert, tend to treat religion differently than people who are raised in a particular religion. That's not a dismissal. It's not a criticism. It's just a fact. Converts have a conversion experience and enthusiasm that, generally speaking, people raised in a religion do not have.
Enthusiasm in religion is a dirty word.
Yeah, well, not to me, but there is a. I'm just noting.
No. I mean, rightfully speaking, it's a dirty word. It refers to a kind of fanaticism. I mean, that is to say, it is a term of art with regard to religion.
Or maybe in a more secular country like Canada, but certainly not in my circles. Enthusiasm in religion is overwhelmingly regarded as a good thing. No,
I just, so would you say that an atheist economist, one who never changed his views about religion, would be someone who would be more trustworthy than Schumacher?
Oh, I didn't say anything about trustworthiness. I simply reflected on what I think is just true to life as I have experienced, that the conversion experience, that people who become and join a religion, that they tend to take it more seriously than people who are born into it, and that it tends to become the dominant way through which they see the world. That doesn't dismiss in any way. That doesn't reduce the truth that they claim. That's just a sociological reality as I see it.
A religion is the primary way in which everyone regards the world. There are no exceptions to this.
Well,
these people who call themselves atheists, their worldview is based on their supposed certainty that there is no God, and in the belief of their intellectual superiority to all those dummies who do believe in God.
Well, I'll just speak from my personal experience. So people who become Orthodox Jews, I noticed that they pray much more diligently in synagogue. The people who are talking about politics and sports and business and gossip in synagogue, they're overwhelmingly people who are raised as Orthodox Jews. The people who are swaying with fervor are the people who either converted or were raised secular and became Orthodox. So I also noticed when I was a Seventh-day Adventist, people who had converted to the church had much more enthusiasm. People who were raised in the church were by and large blasé. So converts, I noticed, tend to put more importance because on their adopted religion, because they've invested more of themselves. That doesn't make it either right or wrong. Doesn't make their insights good or bad. It's just life experience that a convert has invested more of himself, has made more sacrifices than someone who's raised with something from childhood. People who are raised with things tend to be blasé about them and to not appreciate them.
Oh, I think that's a gross oversimplification, but we'll move on.
Okay, I wanted to respond. You said that I have an obsession with one economic model. I notice whenever people use obsession, it's always a put down. So I don't know where I ever said that there's just one economic model for the world. For example, I'm a race realist, and I recognize that different races are better suited to different types of economic systems. And I've said that on some of our shows, that the Anglo people, by and large, seem to be more suited to a free market system than the more conformist East Asian people who are adapted to a very different economic system. So I think the Anglo economic system would not work well for Japan and China, and I'm not sure that the Japanese and Chinese model would work as well for Anglos. And I think every people is better adapted to different forms of political organization and economics organization. So I don't at all think that there's just one economic system for everybody.
I don't think you appreciate the importance of the fact that you live in Los Angeles, which is one of the most deracinated, atomized places on Earth. That the type of life which has evolved in Los Angeles is fundamentally alien to the way that people have lived everywhere throughout history. That if you move to the eastern part of the United States, like the East Coast, you will find that there is far less atomization because people have been there longer. They've actually formed communities. I mean, this is one of the things that Schumacher talks about in this book, is this modern belief that we should just, pick up sticks and move anywhere for our own personal benefit, regardless of the cost to ourselves spiritually or to our families, immediate families, to extended families, or to the community. Again, we get back to this idea that we treasure most the things that can be measured. And money, salary, personal worth can be measured. He writes, to press non-economic values into the framework of the economic calculus, economists use the method of cost-benefit analysis. This is generally thought to be an enlightened and progressive development, as at least an attempt to take an account of costs and benefits which might otherwise be disregarded altogether. In fact, however, it is a procedure by which the higher is reduced to the lower and the priceless is given a price. It can therefore never serve to clarify the situation and lead to enlightened decision. I don't know. I think that it's difficult for me to understand that people can look at the way we live in the West, particularly in rootless places like California or British Columbia, where I live, and not be curious about alternatives.
I'm a convert to Orthodox Judaism. That's a pretty dramatic alternative to the dominant way of life in the West. You say I live a deracinated life in Los Angeles. So yes, literally speaking, as a convert, I may not have a lot of genetic ties to the people that I primarily live with, but I primarily live with Orthodox Jews. I go to synagogue where 3 generations, sometimes 4 generations of a family are all praying, singing, dancing, eating in the same synagogue. I mean, that's the very opposite of a deracinated life. I've lived in Los Angeles for 24 years. I still have many people in my life from that very first time that I've been in Los Angeles. Almost all my friends are Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Judaism is based primarily around the family. and your relations and your community. It's a very intense, connected, bonded, racially bonded, ethnically bonded, religiously bonded way of life. So yeah, there may be many atomized, deracinated people around me, but that's not the world I live in. I live in a world where people have very strong bonds to each other, where people make tremendous sacrifices for each other. And I've been here, as I mentioned, in LA for 24 years. So I've seen my friends have had children and their children have had children. My community, it typically marries around age 20, 21, 22, typically has 5 or 6 children. Of the people that I go to synagogue with, 80% did not go to college. They grow up in Orthodox Jewish day schools, or their friends are Orthodox Jews. They go to yeshiva after day school, and then they take on some kind of craft like plumber, or they go into business because they don't want to be contaminated by the wider world. So the people that I'm attached to, the people that I'm primarily friends with, the people that I spend my time with, are part of a coherent, cohesive, racially united people. It's the very opposite of the atomized, deracinated California life that you portray.
But weren't you saying just the other day that your relationships with others are primarily virtual?
At times. But no, my relationships are not primarily. I think last night I mentioned to you that when I get done with a show, typically I am so exhausted that the reason I've never tried to have a private conversation with you is that I am so exhausted, usually after doing a show, that I don't want to talk anymore. I am just burned out. But I don't talk about the private aspect of my life. There's like, here's my life. So streaming is like on the outside of the circle. The private part, that's going to synagogue every day. That's volunteering in my Jewish community every day. That's spending almost all of the Sabbath with my community. When I socialize during the week, when I have spare time, I'm spending it in real life with people in my religious community. So the circle, that inner circle, that's private, that's sacred. I don't reveal a lot about what goes on there because the bonds are so intense that it would be a betrayal. So in real life, I've mentioned that nobody listens to me for longer than 30 seconds. Yeah, because even in that inner circle, people aren't dying to hear my opinions on politics, religion, and culture. But we have the normal human interchange. Like when I'm talking to people in my religious community, usually there are like 4, 5, 6 of us sitting around a table, and no one person is going to be allowed to dominate the conversation, but it's a very intense back and forth between many people. So if I want to discuss ideas the way that you and I do it, then going online, doing these streams is superior to the, generally speaking, the ideological type of discussions that I can have in my religious community. But as far as just like interpersonal interchange, that takes place in real life. My friends are overwhelmingly within a couple of miles of where I stand right now.
Okay, I don't want to pry, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but there's something about you I've been quite curious about for some time. You've been an Orthodox Jew for how long?
Well, I converted to Judaism in 1993, but I only became Orthodox in 2000. So that is 18 years. And for the first 9 of those years, like from 2000 to 2009, I was trying to get through an Orthodox Jewish conversion process. So only in 2009 did I finally finish the formal conversion process and become formally certified as an Orthodox Jew.
Okay, the reason I asked you this is, you know, that in the book of Genesis, God commands us to be fruitful and multiply. Now, on the one hand, you're constantly talking about population reduction. And on the other hand, you're talking about how your own people typically have large families. It seemed to me that one of the attractions of Orthodox Judaism for a man would be is that a wife is, is considered to be part of the deal. Oh, why have you never married yourself?
It's a good question, and it's a reflection of my own personal failings. And obviously, it points me out as a complete oddball in my religious community. It's like it's completely unacceptable. It's considered pathetic, and it marks you as a stranger among us to a large degree. So as I understand it, of course, people have tremendous amounts of self-deception. But as I spent my 20s basically bedridden, I kind of missed out on that opportunity to launch into life. Most people launch into their careers, into life in their 20s. When I finally emerged from my illness, it was at about 2/3 strength. So I've been struggling with health problems since age 22, which for 6 years was severe. And then after that was simply moderate. But what they did is they kept my life in a vice. That my physical capability, that my vigor and strength was severely limited. Fortunately, in the past 3 years, I've experienced the best health of the last 30 years of my life. And then number two, I've had these disabling addictions, emotional addictions, which continually got in the way of my connecting normally with other people. I was a pussy hound. I was constantly seeking validation by sleeping with women, a variety of women. And I was constantly seeking to be the center of attention in social gatherings by saying provocative things. And so doing, I was blowing up my standing in the community. I was blowing up friendships and relationships. And it's only in the past 2 years, I would say, that I've made some pretty substantial progress and achieved emotional sobriety. I've been sexually sober for approximately 6 years, meaning no screwing around, no pornography. That enabled me to begin to get the other parts of my life on track. Just a few months ago, I finally got out of crippling credit card debt, which again had my life in a vice. And I finally started earning money and being able to contribute more to the community. So I'd say only in the last two to 3 years have I substantially turned things around so that I can stand tall in my community, that I can contribute to the synagogue just like anyone else. And I have been matched up on many occasions, probably, I don't know, 20 to 30 occasions, meaning it's what's called a shidduch, a match to meet someone for possible marriage. And none of them worked out because in many ways I was just such a mess until the last couple of years.
Schumacher writes, the only real effective communication is from man to man, face to face. Do you agree with that?
I'm thinking. I would certainly say it's superior, and if you don't have any of that, if you have very little of that, then you're effectively not communicating. But this kind of virtual communication, such as what we're doing, or it can be a nice supplement. But yeah, the most important thing is face-to-face communication, and then it's wonderful to supplement it in the virtual world with people who share your enthusiasm for ideas. But yeah, the face-to-face is the foundation for sanity and for life.
Okay, now Schumacher talks about Buddhist economics, and he introduces this section of the book with an explanation. The choice of Buddhism for this purpose is purely incidental. The teachings of Christianity, Islam, or Judaism could have been used just as well as those of any of the other great Eastern traditions. So he talks about, what are the three precepts of work that is good? And the precepts are these. He writes, the Buddhist point of view takes the function of work to be at least threefold: to give a man a chance to utilize and develop his faculties, to enable him to overcome his ego-centeredness by joining with other people in a common task, and to bring forth the goods and services needed for a becoming existence. Again, the consequences that flow from this view are endless. To organize work in such a manner that it becomes meaningless, boring, stultifying, or nerve-wracking for the worker would be little short of criminal. It would indicate a greater concern with goods than with people, an evil lack of compassion, and a soul-destroying degree of attachment to the most primitive side of this worldly existence. Equally, to strive for leisure as an alternative to work would be considered as a complete misunderstanding of one of the basic truths of human existence, namely that work and leisure are complementary parts of the same living process and cannot be separated without destroying the joy of work and the bliss of leisure. Now, I could point out that the three precepts which he names, you would find certainly in Europe in the High Middle Ages. What do you think of the passage I just read?
This is my immediate reaction from life within Orthodox Judaism. The men that I know sacrifice to work a great deal, to earn a great deal, to support large families. So those three precepts seem to be luxury items or even irrelevant to them, because they're typically facing $100,000 a year in yeshiva bills. Rent is a minimum of $5,000 a month. And so right there, they need to bring home at least $200,000 a year. And so all those precepts that you just listed, they're much less important to the men I know than providing for their family. And so if you have a why, I think it was Nietzsche who said this, you can overcome the lack of those three precepts. You can do work that is humdrum, you can do work that is stultifying, you can do work that is not rewarding if you're doing it in purpose of providing for a family that you love, for being a proud, upstanding member of your community. If you're doing the work for a worthy cause, then I don't think those precepts are important.
It seems to me that a way of life that requires $200,000 a year, 200,000 US dollars a year is not very supportable.
It's a difficult and challenging way of life, and it really only works for people with an IQ over 115. If you're under that, you're going to be one of the losers of the community. It's no fun to be the poorest member of your synagogue. It's no fun to be someone who's continually taking charity from your community. So by and large, the people who can't keep up often start moving on the road to assimilation and to less expensive ways of life.
When the Orthodox Jews were living in the shtetls, they weren't earning $200,000 a year. How did they make it?
Well, their living expenses weren't nearly as great. So by and large, Jews in the Western world have had higher living standards than the non-Jews around them. So even though there's been tremendous poverty in Jewish history, you have to compare it to the people that they were living around. Compared to the people that they were living around, Jews, generally speaking, have been better off, had an easier life, had longer lives, and were able to support more children than the non-Jews around them. So in the shtetl, there were Jews, of course, who were peddlers, who would hit the road to sell their wares to support their wife and kids. But the community found ways, people would sacrifice. So it's contextual. Like people who can't make it in Los Angeles move to Cleveland. I have friends who just couldn't financially keep up living in Los Angeles. So they moved to Cleveland, where real estate prices were 1/5 what they are in Los Angeles. So there are alternatives if you can't keep up, but it means you need to leave Los Angeles, you need to leave San Francisco, you need to leave New York City, and you need to move to places like Cleveland for a much less expensive way of life.
You mentioned you had a friend, a Jewish friend, who had worked as a teacher. That was his profession.
Yeah.
And you said that he had said that looking back, he would have chosen a better profession or a more lucrative profession. I found this very sad for the reason that, well, until recently, teaching was a high status occupation in the West. Teachers have in the last generation traded this status for money. They are not very highly regarded anymore. But aren't you saddened by your friend's confession? I mean, to be a teacher, to work hard at it, to be good at it is noble. And here he was lamenting, oh, I should have earned more money.
Yeah, just to clarify, it wasn't a friend. It was someone I read about, someone who had converted to Orthodox Judaism, and then only after he retired or in his 60s, he made this remark, oh, I just realized that, or I have come to realize that Jews don't have any respect for you unless you earn. So the more traditional you get in Jewish life, the more respect is accorded to the teacher. So in my traditional Orthodox Jewish community, teachers receive great respect. And some of them also work additional jobs on the side to support their families. And modern Orthodox Jewish day schools, by and large, are staffed by traditional Orthodox Jews. By and large, modern Orthodox Jews, they aren't willing to become teachers in Jewish day schools because the pay is not very good compared to going to business or a profession. But those with more of a commitment to Judaism, they're more willing to make the sacrifice to work for, well, let's say $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 a year as a teacher in Los Angeles, as opposed to being a dentist, doctor, or lawyer, where you'd be more likely to make $150,000 to $200,000 or possibly even more dollars a year. So the more devoted the Jew is to his religion, the more he is willing to sacrifice for it, the more veneration he gives to teachers. But there's a somewhat cynical saying in Jewish life that rabbi is no job for a nice Jewish boy, meaning that even though rabbis typically make six figures or more, generally speaking, the social milieu of Jews, except for the most religious ones, is that you should earn much more money than that.
I find that a very sad confession, I must say. But let's move on to another subject. Schumacher writes, take the question of size in a city. While one cannot judge these things with precision, I think it is fairly safe to say that the upper limit of what is desirable for the size of a city is probably something of the order of 500,000 inhabitants. It is quite clear that above such a size, nothing is added to the virtue of the city. In places like London or Tokyo or New York, the millions do not add to the city's real value, but merely create enormous problems and produce human degradation. So probably the order of magnitude of 500,000 inhabitants could be looked upon as the upper limit. What do you think of that?
Yeah, again, I'm skeptical because I think if you have a happy, fulfilling life, let's say, I don't know Roman Catholicism that well, but I'd have to think that there are plenty of Roman Catholics in major cities who are closely integrated into their parish, who have fulfilling high-paying work, who have lived have several generations of their family have lived in their community. And so for them, living in New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Miami or Denver or Seattle is a happy thing. I think it works for some people. I know the community I know best is Orthodox Jews. They overwhelmingly live in big cities, and it works for them because there are certain requirements you have as an Orthodox Jew. You need to have a mikveh, you need to have a kosher butcher, you need to have synagogues and yeshivas and Jewish day schools all nearby. They basically need to be within walking distance. So Orthodox Jews overwhelmingly live in urban environments, and it works for them. So I'm skeptical of that analysis, because also I live in Los Angeles and I love living in Los Angeles. For example, I get to have face-to-face gatherings with other writers where I get to mix with people who write for the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Los Angeles Times, or people who write scripts for major studios. And I could only have these social gatherings with elite writers if I was living in a big city. If I was living in a country town, I'd be much less likely to be able to have consistent gatherings with the elite in the writing profession. So I'm curious what you think of Schumacher's analysis.
Well, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, the Catholics were largely chased out of New York City in the 1960s and the 1970s. White flight, they called it, but it was really kind of a non-fatal genocide. So, you know, New York is very different than it used to be in that respect. You know, I lived in San Diego, which is not Los Angeles, but it is SoCal, and it is similar in many respects. A city being divided and subdivided endlessly by freeways, I just found intolerable. I'll just give you one example. When I lived in San Diego, I lived just up the hill from the Pacific Coast Highway. And there was, if I wanted to shop at any place that wasn't the gas station at the bottom of the hill, I had to go to this neighborhood called Hillside, which you will see described as the gay neighborhood, which it is that, but is mostly the student neighborhood, because San Diego State University is near there. Now, the apartment complex that I lived in, there was a yard in the back. There's a huge complex, and there was greenery, but there was a lawn in the back of the building that I lived in, and if you walk to the end of it, I could pick up a stone and throw it, and it would have landed on Washington Street, which is the main thoroughfare through Hillside. But there was no pedestrian access from my building. What I had to do was walk all the way down the hill and then walk up the freeway, literally on the side of the freeway, to get to this neighborhood. And and then I would see all these people walking on the freeway, some of them, pushing carts, because it was well understood that that was the only way to get, that these neighborhoods are built to exclude pedestrian access, because the assumption is that everyone uses a car to do anything. That if they were to go, say, to the gas station at the bottom of the hill, they would get in their car and they would walk the 4 blocks. You talked about social interactions. I worked at the radio station, and occasionally people who at Kogo would get together after work and have a couple of beers. And the same thing always happened, that people would start talking about, hey, we're having a lot of fun. We should spend more time together outside work. Yeah, absolutely. So how about if we do something this Saturday? And then they'd start calculating the distance between where they lived and where we were supposed to go. Oh, yeah, and it would take me X amount. It would take me an hour or whatever to get there, and then there'd be the hour or more back, and it was always abandoned. All these attempts for people to get together after work were abandoned, every single one, because it would just be too much trouble, because everyone is so spread out.
Okay, let me give my experience. I was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, and Seventh-day Adventists hold that cities are just centers of iniquity. Seventh-day Adventism is very rural, very anti-urban in its orientation. So that's how I grew up. And after a while, I yearned to live in the big city. So I moved to Los Angeles in '94. And I've always constructed a life where I have never had a daily commute longer than 20 minutes. So that's just a high value to me, to not, let alone, I never take public transportation. I think I've taken it twice in my 24 years in Los Angeles. So I stay away from public transport. And I've created a life where I make sure that everything, that my commute is minimal. So that might mean I leave at 6 a.m. and come back at 2 p.m. But I just put a premium on my happiness and staying out of long, draining commutes. I live in the Pico Robertson neighborhood. I've always lived here for pretty much as long as I've been in Los Angeles. And everything I need is here. For many, many years, I worked from home. And I would start my day at 6 a.m. at synagogue. We would have Talmud studies. 7 a.m. we would have prayer. After that, we would nosh. We would have something to eat. It was easy to meet up with friends for coffee. Orthodox Jews have to live within walking distance of the synagogue. So there are thousands of Orthodox Jews near me. There's 100 Orthodox synagogues. And so everything I need is right here. There are 40 kosher restaurants within a mile of where I stand. There's a public library less than a mile away. There's a superb Beverly Hills public library about 2 miles away. There are parks near me. The streets here are lined with palm trees and flowering jacaranda trees. Life is good. The ocean is 10 miles away. All my 12-step programs are fewer than 10 miles away. There's a low-cost therapy center about a mile from me. I went there for many years to get weekly psychotherapy. I've had particular problems with my feet that required specialized physical therapy. And so I have 2 excellent physical therapists. One's in downtown, so that's like a 10-mile drive. The other one's in Santa Monica, again, about a 10-mile drive, but very, very doable if I simply schedule it off hours. So on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays, like everything is within walking distance. That's when I'm with my friends. That's when I go to people's homes. So I found that you can create a really sweet life in a big city if you're able to you can live in a place where everything you need pretty much is within walking distance. I was blessed for years to be able to work from home, but that didn't mean necessarily such isolation, because I could go to synagogue, I could meet friends for coffee, and pretty much everything I need is less than 10 miles from where I stand, and that's the way it's always been for my 24 years in Los Angeles.
These things which are 10 miles away, which you talked about, how do you get there?
Oh, I drive.
Oh, okay.
But I schedule it so that I miss rush hour.
Okay, I was just going to point out that 10 miles in a city as big as Los Angeles is an enormous distance.
Yeah, but I can do it in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, less than 30 minutes if it's not on rush hour. So I will often leave the house at 5 a.m., 4 a.m., 5:30 a.m., and there's virtually no traffic on the road at 5:30 a.m. And so I can get to places, I can get to meetings or a coffee house or hang out or go into a building if I have a pass, and I can just have a nice leisurely breakfast and do everything I want to do. So for me, it's a very high value to avoid being stuck in traffic.
When I first moved to San Diego, I stayed for about a month in the house of my boss, who lived in this place called Escondido. And one night, we typically left the building about 6:30. The show was, from 3 to 6, and there were things to do after the show. We left at 6:30, and so he was driving, to his house, and I was with him. And we were on the access road to the freeway and moving along pretty nicely. And then we hit the freeway, and it was like something that I'd read in Mad Magazine in the 1960s. This comic strip about Sunday drive. The family gets together for Sunday drive, and yeah, okay, we're making good time now, but wait till we get to the freeway. And they get to the freeway, and it's a parking lot. And that was my experience in San Diego, in the road to Escondido. And I just thought, how is it that people aren't shooting each other all the time here? It's almost 7 o'clock and the traffic isn't moving. I mean, your experience is somewhat different, but you'd have to admit that if you had to earn the kind of money that you say is necessary to live, the whole 9 yards as an Orthodox Jew, this would probably require a considerable commute on your part, would it not?
Probably, but it's all a matter of priorities. Like, I know all sorts of people who complain about their commute. It takes them an hour and a half to go 10 miles. Okay, but they are choosing to leave at 7:30 a.m. If they left their house at 6 a.m., they'd be at work in 40 minutes. If they left their house at 5 a.m., they'd be at work in less than half an hour. So they choose to leave and to drive rush hour traffic. Like, I chose jobs where I could get into work either before or after rush hour traffic, and then leave either before or after rush hour traffic. So generally speaking, on Los Angeles's west side, if you coming home after 7 p.m., most of the time from Santa Monica to Pico Robertson, the traffic moves at a decent clip, and you'll be home in less than 30 minutes for like a 7-8 mile commute. And but if you try to leave from 3:30 p.m. to 7 p.m., it's not going to be good. But I don't understand. Like, I know these doctors and lawyers, every day they're complaining to me about their commute. I don't know why they don't take an Uber. If they insist on leaving at 7:30 a.m., take an Uber, chill out in the back, listen to a book, read a book, have your laptop, do whatever, instead of sitting fuming in traffic. I mean, I don't understand why they don't adjust their commute schedule so that they come in at 6 a.m. and skip it, or take an Uber. You're earning $200 as an attorney, $200 an hour. You can afford an Uber, and you can just lie back in the back of the car and listen to your favorite book, or read a book, or do something else, and not allow the traffic to get you down.
Well, that's an interesting question, but I must say I was greatly amused by your suggestion about leaving earlier. There's lots of jobs which are 8 to 5, say, right? Or 9 to 5. What good is getting there at 7 o'clock? What are you supposed to do for that hour or two? That's another hour or two you are spending at work.
Every employer I've had, if I was faced with this situation, they would allow me to adjust my schedule. I was valuable enough to them that if I needed to start work at 7 a.m. instead of their preferred 9 a.m., I had a really good chance of making that happen. On those occasions where I didn't make it happen, let's say work inflexibly starts at 9 a.m., but I get in at 7 a.m., there's often a gym in the building. There's like a lovely place to walk. There's coffee houses. I can have a leisurely breakfast. I have about 90 minutes of very light, they're not really exercises, but procedures that I like to do. So I could hang out in the boss's office and I do these tension release procedures. I do meditation. I make phone calls. I write in my journal. I read a book. I would much rather have a pleasant, happy life where I'm not bumping up against rush hour traffic. I get into work early. It's absolutely quiet in the office, and I do my exercises. I make my phone calls. I have a leisurely breakfast. I read the newspaper. I write in my journal. There are just so many things that you can do. I don't know why people keep pushing themselves through hell when most employers would be perfectly fine with you arriving to work an hour early and eating your breakfast then.
Well, here we see the phenomenon of a work and private life merging. People who have no work life and people who have no private life, because it's the same thing. I mean, this idea of, oh yeah, let's hang out at the office for an extra couple of hours because, you know, I can read the newspaper or enjoy a leisurely cup of coffee. No, I don't want to spend any more time at the office than I have to. I mean, people work far too much as it is now.
Well, it all depends on the office. Like, I've worked in beautiful offices. I mean, the view out the window is beautiful. The boss is fine with me using the office whenever he's not there. I'm stretched out. I can rest. I talk to my friends. I get on my laptop. It's a very pleasant environment. So work, for many people, work is one of the favorite things in the day because they like the people they're around. I've worked on suites where I get along with everyone. We all get along. And then I've worked on office suites where it's just absolutely toxic. But if you are on a suite where everybody gets along and you even have some friends there, going to work is something that you look forward to. If going to work is filled with hostility, then obviously you're not going to enjoy spending time there. But then you can choose to seek out a job where things are much more pleasant. We're not slaves. We don't have to work for abusive bosses. I have always pretty much chosen to work for bosses who have complete trust in me, to the extent that, yeah, I can use the office whenever I want to. I can surf the web on the office computer. I can do my exercises. I can make my personal phone calls. I can just hang out and have a pleasant life and skip the rush hour if I want to. I can go work in the gym, work out in the gym, and like work. There's nothing wrong with having friends at work. There's nothing wrong with work being a social, pleasant experience. There's nothing wrong with making human connections at work.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that what you're describing is unrealistic because for a great many Americans, I'd say probably a majority of Americans and Canadians, they are effectively slaves. The freedom in the job market that existed a couple of generations ago has disappeared. That increasingly we're told that we're going to have half a dozen different careers in our lives. In fact, we're not supposed to think of careers. Everyone's talking up this gig economy, and what we hear from people like Krugman is learn to code. It's the stability that you describe is perhaps you've been lucky in that respect, but it's something that few people can count on. I wanted to talk about this idea of the consumer.
I just want to make a quick rejoinder, if I may.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I think that the slavery you describe is primarily in the mind. If people keep up their job skills and keep up their personal skills so that people like them, and they are therefore an asset to an organization or an office that they join, that there's much more flexibility. On the other hand, if people are continually getting into feuds or ticking off people that they work with, then that will create a diminishing of possibilities and a feeling of enslavement.
Well, I really couldn't disagree with you more. What we've seen in recent decades in the United States and in other places such as Japan is a hollowing out of middle management. GE fired hundreds of thousands of people, something that P.J. O'Rourke celebrated. These were losers, according to him. If you have spent, 25, you graduate from university and you spend, 25, 30 years at a company like GE, and you're earning a good salary, if you get fired, your work life is effectively over. You will never be hired at a decent job again, or it is unlikely that you will, for this reason, that you are radioactive to employers because you have earned so much money in the past that they will make the assumption that you would be bitter working for substantially less money. Because of your previous prominence and your years of experience, you are going to be considered, perhaps rightly, as far less tractable than some guy who's just graduated from university. And also, the contemporary fashion of American business is to work people to death. This has been explained to me in terms of, job hunting, the attitude to take. And it basically goes like this, that I will willingly, gleefully work myself to death for this organization. And I was instructed, I said, oh, well, yeah, you got these kids and, their mother. And I mean, you don't deny it because it's true, but, don't bring it up. And if it comes up, try to get away from that, because of the assumption that a man with family responsibilities is going to be less eager to work himself to death. Also, I was told, stay away from any discussions of hobbies or interests. You don't have any, as far as they're concerned, because of, their assumption that a man who was greatly interested in other things, well, again, he's not going to be so willing to work himself to death for the organization. I mean, what the deal is in Silicon Valley. They have ping pong tables, and they have video games and pinball machines, and they have candy walls, and they have hammocks. And the reason they have all those things is to let the people who work there know that you don't have to go home, because this is your home. Your work is your home. And we're going to we have chefs here to make you fabulous meals. The idea is, no, don't ever leave. Keep working always. And what many of these Silicon Valley companies do is they simply fire people when they turn 30 or around the time they turn 30, because they've made a calculation that they've squeezed about as much juice as they can from these people.
When you sell yourself short, there is no end of people who will take advantage of you. So if you're willing to work yourself into a situation that's very dangerous for your health, that's on you. You've made some bad choices to put yourself in that position, and you need to learn to make better choices. I notice that people who are pleasant to be around, who are flexible, who get along with others, and who are literate, can glide into new jobs. And the stability is that you are a person who gets along with others. If you're a person who gets along with others and are willing to be of service to your employer, you will glide from opportunity to opportunity. And I also know within my religious community is we look after each other. We help each other out. If someone's out of a job, we help them find a new job. We don't just sit back when people are struggling. If someone's business is struggling, we all pitch in to support them. And so if one leads an atomized life where you're not closely connected with other people in some sort of ethnic or religious community, you're going to have a much more difficult time of it. But if you are connected to other people, if you volunteer, if you are a known quantity, if people like you, if you are a contributor, people are going to want to help you out. I've gotten jobs, mainly just referrals from synagogue. I know rabbis who've started having a lot of kids, and they could no longer make it on just a teacher's salary or a rabbinic salary. So then the more affluent members of the shul bring them into the business. And I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. It wasn't as close-knit as Orthodox Judaism, but still there was definitely a sense of people looking out for each other. And I'm sure that any regular at a Catholic church who becomes closely connected with his Catholic community, you're going to have people who will look out for you. I know in recessions, frequently for rabbis, their primary task, the number one job for rabbis often in a recession, is to find jobs for their congregants. And rabbis will make calls, and they will make it their priority to make sure that their congregants who want jobs have jobs. I don't know if priests do the same thing or Protestant clergy do the same thing, but to me, that should be one of the priorities of the clergy, is to look out for the well-being of your congregants.
You're talking about a very small religious community, the one that you belong to. And these kind of affinity networks obviously can work when you're talking about small numbers of people. They cannot work when you're talking about tens of millions of people. I mean, you are arguing from the particular to the general, and your own particular is not representative. I mean, I can tell you that in the United States of America and in my country of Canada, that capital, it's not just that capital has the upper hand over labor, it's that labor is begging for its existence.
I'm curious, do priests that you've known, have they made it a priority to find jobs for their congregants?
They're not in any position to find jobs for their congregants.
What, you mean they don't know people who are employers?
No. They don't have any pull. They don't have any pull.
They couldn't call up a member of their congregation who, let's say, operates a business with 40 employees and say, hey, a fellow member of the congregation is looking for work. He's got this job history. Do you think you could use him?
The fellow on the other end of the priest isn't going to make that call, and the fellow on the other end of the line wouldn't be interested. I should hire someone because he's part of the parish. It doesn't work. These people have to be responsible to the bottom line. I mean, it's 7% growth a year isn't good enough. We're looking at 15, 20% growth a year. And, if you can't reach that, then, people will be fired.
Well, I bet prior to the 1960s, there were a lot of Catholics who looked out for each other, who passed on job tips where priests would connect people and help people find jobs.
You're talking about a world that was destroyed by the Great Society, when the Catholic communities of places like Brooklyn and Queens, in the Bronx, they were destroyed. They were deliberately destroyed. These people were run out of town in the same way that a large part of the Catholic community in Boston was run out of town by busing and by integration. And they moved out to the suburbs and they became atomized because the powers that be decided that the existence of tightly knit ethnic communities of Catholics was inimical to their interests.
Yeah, that's absolutely horrifying. And in support of your points, as you helped instruct me by giving me that book by Ha-Joon Hang, or the 23 Things You Don't Know About Capitalism. I never realized it so starkly that wages are determined by the amount of immigration. I mean, that is just so stark. It's just such a clear, obvious truth. And governments, by determining levels of immigration, essentially determine wages and affordable family formation. And most of the problems that you have been describing over the past half hour would be considerably diminished by stopping immigration. Almost all the problems that you've described over the past half hour have primarily been caused by reckless amounts of immigration.
No, you're absolutely right about that. But I mean, Schumacher deals with this in the book when he talks about, what is the purpose of the poor in the world? And he writes, the role of the poor is to be the gap fillers in the requirements of the rich. That is a very profound statement, that American companies decided that, we're a profitable company, all right, but we're not profitable enough, particularly those companies that went public. They were listed on stock exchanges. Then it starts. Oh, no, 7% profit every year. That's not good enough. You want to double that. And if you won't double that, heads are going to roll. So how can you double that? Well, one of the things you do is you can slash research and development. Another thing that you can do is you can cut salaries, but you can simply eliminate workers. Okay, so, we produce things, right? Like the iPhone. What, these things couldn't be built or assembled in the United States? Of course they were. The United States used to make amplifiers, receivers, radios, televisions. All those things were built in the United States. But it was decided that since there are these poor people who could do it, that we're going to take this work away from Americans. And since this was more efficient, as economists reckon it, then there was no objection allowed to it. Well, it would just be crazy to build things in the United States when we can build them in Indonesia for pennies on the dollar. I've mentioned this before, like at Foxconn. Oh, yeah, they're grateful. They're grateful for the work, these Asianers. Yeah, they're so grateful that suicide nets have to be put up in the buildings to prevent them from, hurling themselves to their deaths. I want to talk about this idea of man as consumer that Schumacher goes into. This term consumer, you start hearing it in the 1960s and it becomes more popular in the 1970s. You have that magazine, Consumer Reports. You have consumers organizations. But politicians and other leaders referring to their citizens as consumers, this is sinister. It's absolutely sinister, because apparently the purpose of human life is to consume. That we are just consuming machines. We consume, and the more we consume, the better. And then we stopped consuming. One day we stopped consuming, and that used to be called death. Schumacher writes, anything we do under the head of production is subject to the economic calculus, and anything we do under the heading of consumption is not. But real life is very refractory to such classifications, because man as producer and man as consumer is in fact the same man, who is always producing and consuming all the same time. Even a worker in his factory consumes certain amenities, commonly referred to as working conditions, and when insufficient amenities are provided, he cannot or refuses to carry on. And even in the man who consumes water and soap may be said to be producing cleanliness. We produce in order to be able to afford certain amenities and comforts as consumers. If, however, somebody demanded these same amenities and comforts while he was engaged in production, he would be told that this would be uneconomic, that it would be inefficient, and that society could not afford such inefficiency. In other words, everything depends on whether it is done by man as producer or by man as consumer. If man as producer travels first class or uses a luxurious car, this is called a waste of money. But if the same man in his other incarnation, as man as consumer, does the same, this is called a sign of a high standard of life. Now, we talk about production, and the term that was used at the time was gross national product, but now we use the term gross domestic product, or GDP. Now, I can tell you, I can testify reliably that 50 years ago, in 1968, that very few people ever heard the term GNP. If you read the economics section of the newspaper, you might come across stories that referred to the GNP. But now, this term GDP is in constant use. And apparently the growth of the GDP is deemed to be the only measure of success in our economy. Actually, there's one other measure, which is the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or say the S&P 500. These indexes. If the GDP is rising at, say, greater than 2% a year, and the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 are in good shape, then it is said that the economy is good. The fact that that in the United States over 100 million people had given up looking for work, this was irrelevant, completely irrelevant. You see, they're not counted as part of the wage, part of the employment figure, because after a certain amount of time, you're just written off. You don't matter anymore. And the fact that ordinary people would talk about the Dow Jones, I mean, do you own any stock yourself? You could ask these people. No. Well, then, I don't know, does your company's pension plan, does it own stock? Pension plan? No, my company doesn't have a pension plan. So why would you care about the Dow Jones? Why would you care about the GDP? I mean, is there some sort of betting pool that reimburses you based on how high the GDP rises? Well, no. But so this abstraction, what difference does it make to you? You see the predations of economists here in that they have managed to convince us that indexes are the only measure of human success or happiness. I mean, sorry, I'm just going to briefly, since 2008, there has been this enormous surplus of people who've been effectively out of work since that time. And no, but as long as the Dow Jones keeps rising, and as long as we can nudge that GDP up, we'll be able to sell to people, to the normies, to the Muppets, that everything's all right. Sorry, go ahead.
From what I understand, the stock market is the best predictor of the future direction of the economy. So when the stock market goes into a prolonged slump, I'm not talking about a daily slump or even a weekly slump or even a month-long slump, but if the stock market dramatically drops in value, it accurately presages a drop in the economy, which when the GDP is retracting, is getting smaller, when predictions are that the GDP looks to be headed for a downward slope rather than for a rise, then there are all sorts of ramifications. You don't get raises, generally speaking, when the economy is heading down. If you got a worker on the edge, they're much more likely to get fired. You feel your boss growing in power, the more perilous state the economy is in, as opposed to right now when the economy is booming, when employment is rising. As a worker, you feel that you have many more possibilities, and because you do, there's much more hiring going on. So there is relevance to real people in noticing things such as the stock market and the gross national product. A couple of other points. I've long noticed that Australia and England have traditionally been much more cohesive countries than the United States of America, and I would assume Canada too. That I would assume that prior to the 1980s, that there was a sense pretty strong in Australia, in England, and I would assume in Canada too, that you're all in it together. America's always been much more individualist and much more diverse, and so much less of a sense of cohesion. But I know from growing up in Australia, this idea of doing it for Australia, and this sense of ease with your fellow Australian, because you've got a racially cohesive and coherent society that is more than 95% white, and Australia has long been the best place in the world to be an average bloke. I think that racial homogeneity and religious homogeneity helps to knit a people together, and so that there's much less reckless, careless behavior by employers, because employers in these countries feel much more connected to their communities. They may well have been in their communities over generations, while America is much more individualist, and so employers can be much more reckless. And I think this movement to looking at consumers, it's a function of an increasingly secular society, and you feel the presence of God very differently depending on where you're at. You don't really feel the presence of God at Dodger Stadium. You don't really feel the presence of God in your typical bar or disco or nightclub. You do feel the presence of God at a church or synagogue. You do feel the presence of God when you're around people who take religion seriously. As we become more secular, then there's been much more of a tendency to look at people as consumers or as just like individual dots in an economic pattern. When one has a religious view, there's much more of a sacred sense of life.
I have to disagree with you strongly with regard to what you're saying about the stock market. Analysts used to talk about the price to earnings ratio, that you could determine whether the stock price of a company was over or undervalued by looking at what multiple of earnings the share price was trading at. From about 2000 onwards, and especially from about 2010 onwards, it's completely meaningless. These companies are trading at insane price to earnings ratios. One of the reasons for that is because they cheat, because they don't use mark to market. They value things based on unicorn theory, and that they include goodwill as actual assets. Another way they cheat is they're buying back their own stock. They're looting the company treasury to buy back their own stock to raise the price. The bubble in the stock market, which many intelligent people thought was going to burst, let's say 3 years ago, still hasn't. And it's led to the problem described in the movie Withnail and I as the rising balloon problem. That if you're holding on to a rope which is attached to a balloon which is rising, you don't want to let go of the rope because you understand that you're going to fall to your death. But the longer you hold on to the rope, the higher the balloon rises and the less chance that you will survive. To measure the soundness of any particular firm or the economy as a general by stock prices is a mug's game. And that very high stock markets have typically been associated in American history with crashes of the economy.
Well, I'm just thinking of my lifetime. So about 1979, 1980, was it 80, around then, the stock market was near record lows. And then it steadily began going up under Reagan. It was going up for about 18 months to 2 years before the economy finally started booming in 1983. So the stock market indicated that a boom was coming. Similarly, a stock market retraction in 1989, 1990 was before the H.W. Herbert Walker Bush recession that swept through in 1991. Again, the stock market boomed under Clinton, starting about 1996, and it presaged a good long run for the economy. Now, you're right, the stock market can be distorted by artificially low interest rates, which is what we've had over the past 9 years. Because when you have low interest rates, then there's no sense in putting money into bonds. Therefore, the stock market becomes much more a likely recipient for investment, and that's kind of propped up and driven much of the increase. It's an artificial and stock market due to these absurdly low interest rates. Now interest rates are going up. Perhaps the stock market will come back to a more realistic level. On the other hand, it's really hard to judge what's going to happen to the economy, and so we may have been living in an artificially induced bubble for the last 8 years, even though there was virtually no economic growth under Obama. Perhaps we were saved from an even more severe recession by these artificially low interest rates, and maybe at some point we will have to pay the piper, and a recession unlike anything we've known for 90 years will rip through us. If we do hit such a recession, it's really important that you have good relationships with other people. Like, it's really, so many people I know are just callous with their family relationships. Like they've stopped talking to their mother and father. They have siblings that they never talk to. They're feuding with their uncle. They're just careless about their family relationships. So when there is a severe recession, your family should be the first people that you talk to either help out or to receive help. And if one has not invested in one's familial relationships, one's going to be in great trouble. Similarly, friends. If one has been a good friend, your friends are going to be much more likely to want to be there for you in difficult situations like a recession. And also, if you're an integral part of your religious or ethnic community, you're much more likely to have bonds and ties with other people who can help you navigate a severe recession. If you're an atomized individual without strong ties to other people, without strong ties to a community, without strong bonds with your family, you're going to be much more likely to be in a great deal of trouble if you suffer a severe illness, if the economy hits a major recession. So the way to weather crises is by investing in relationships with family and friends and community and religion prior to the bad times, because then you're making a bank account with other people that you may well be able to draw upon in a time of crisis. But if you haven't made those deposits of building relationships with people, of volunteering in your community, of being someone who has a track record of giving to others, then you're not likely to find many people willing to give to you when you hit a hard time.
I wanted to point out that the media, which doesn't really understand much about economics but knows which side it's on, and this side is globalism, is cheering for this balloon, the stock market. Of course, now they have a problem because, when Obama was in power for 8 years, then the rising Dow Jones and S&P 500 proved what a Jim Dandy president he was. And so the fact that it's kept rising under Trump is problematic, as they like to say. But Schumacher, his book was written in the 1970s, the early 1970s, And much has changed in the capitalist system since then. Pretty much that we don't live under capitalism anymore. That is to say that the traditional definition of capitalism was people saving money, loaning it to banks at interest, and the banks then in turn loaning that at somewhat higher interest to businesses that are starting out or expanding. That's no longer how the system works. The government creates the money. And Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided at roughly the year 2000 that he was going to abolish the business cycle. And it's downturns in the business cycle that led to what we call recessions. And Greenspan decided that we couldn't have that anymore. With the result, it's like a body that is filling up with poison and is not being purged of it. Recessions are they're hurtful in that, you know, people lose their jobs and they lose money. But on the other hand, it's very healthy for the economy, that it keeps the economy in check. You know, it allows a kind of equilibrium to come about. Now, the other thing that we have this, you know, cheering for the balloon, that the Dow Jones has to go up and up and up. You will remember roughly 2005, 2006, that the people in the media were cheering for the housing boom. Housing prices are going higher and higher. That's great. And they're going to continue to soar into the stratosphere. That's even better. Yeah. Have you noticed how expensive houses are? Well, of course, we're saying how good that is. How about people who are trying to buy a house for the first time? How can they possibly afford this? Because if there's any kind of downturn in the housing market, that'll never happen. It'll never happen. Yeah, but if there is a downturn in the housing market, these people will be faced with the horror of owning a fortune on houses which are worth, say, half as much as when they bought them, which is precisely what happened. That fellow on Fox, is he called Neil Cavuto?
Yes.
When Fox came to Canada, the Fox News Network, they gave it free to cable subscribers for a month or two. So I watched a bunch of it, and I saw this fellow Cavuto on, and he was talking up the housing market, and things were just up, 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 and they were going to stay up, up, up. And he said that, you know, some people, they have a problem with speculation. And he said, I can't imagine why that is. Speculation is a good thing. And I nearly fell over. Is this what we've come to? That people praising pure speculation? Hey, no one will need to have jobs anymore because we'll all just be buying houses and flipping them. Is that the idea? You remember that, you know, in the last decade, you had all these day traders, right? You remember the day trader craze? Luke? Hang on. No, just the day trader craze where these people stayed at home and their laptops, they would buy and sell stocks. And one of the problems the day traders had was that in periods of intense volatility, they could not get through to the trading platforms fast enough to avoid being wiped out. And you had all of these people who were flipping houses, that it seemed to be seriously suggested. And people would spend hundreds of dollars to go on these weekend seminars where they would be told, you know, distressed properties, you know, the various kinds of distressed properties, how you find out about the distressed properties, how you buy the distressed properties, you know, with no money down or close to no money down, and how you make a few superficial changes and then you flip the property and you get big, big money. And again, before the 2007, 2008 crash, there seemed to be, you know, a large number of people writing about economics who envisioned a future where we'd have millions of, maybe tens of millions of people whose livelihood was flipping houses and day trading stocks. And
Yeah,
see, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I
you
had
go
a
ahead.
friend who was. I've had friends who are day traders. So yeah, quite a few people I know thought they could make a living that way.
Well, Schumacher devotes a chapter to economic planning, and he comes to the conclusion that there's not much to it. Because essentially, what economic planning is, when it's not pure wish fulfillment, is saying, here are today's trends, or more likely, here are yesterday's trends, and we can extrapolate from yesterday's trends into the future 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, etc. And that is simply not true. He said plans are put forward which, upon inspection, turn out to relate to events totally outside the control of the planner. Now, you will notice that all of these assumptions having to do with the state of the economy, with rise in GDP, deficit, and debt levels are largely based upon the price of oil. And we don't know what the price of oil is going to be. Because again, there's this whipsaw effect that Kunstler talked about, the $75 rule. Schumacher was a senior bureaucrat in the British government for many years. He was the senior economist to the National Coal Board. And coal used to be a very big industry in Britain. I'm sure that young people would have no idea that that was the case. But Schumacher was rather astonished that the economists and the governments were moving towards away from coal and looking to substitute it with oil, which he thought was not a good idea. It turns out he was correct. Now, you have all these anti-coal zealots in the United States, despite the fact that improvements in pollution technology have made coal pretty clean these days, But starting earlier, I discussed the oil problem, and we see the question of the scarcity of oil. That if economic growth is dependent upon oil, then we better find oil. Now, people talk about fracking. It's not viable now. It requires so much energy, the use of so much energy, literally, like scalding hot water. And also because these wells typically decline by 50%, their output within 18 months. So you have to keep drilling holes. More and more and more holes. Rex Tillerson, who was formerly Secretary of State.
Yes.
And was the head of ExxonMobil, he confessed that his company lost its shirt on fracking. The oil price would have to be at $150 or more for fracking to become economic. Does money continue to be invested in it? But it seems to be on the principle that we lose money on every gallon, but we're going to make it up in volume. It's the old joke, has it. But, anyone who has studied, even at a superficial level, the oil industry knows that new oil is being found. The problem is typically it's found offshore. And maybe not just a mile or two offshore, considerable miles offshore. That is to say that the major oil projects, which were all put on hold or canceled after the oil price collapsed a couple of years ago, they require a stupendous amount of money to find, extract this oil. And the technologies which they use to extract the oil, the platforms, etc., are very, very expensive to build and maintain. So, Schumacher's complaint about risking the economy of the growth of the world economy on oil, he turned out to be very prescient in that regard. Now, it's curious to me that in the 1970s, there were two big oil shocks. The first one had to do with the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And the second had to do with the revolution in Iran in 1979. Now, at the time, we were told that life would never be the same again, that we simply could not go forward with our reliance or being handcuffed to fossil fuels. Now, it is now 45 years since the first oil shock, and not much has changed. So-called alternative energy adds very little to the grid. Very little. And the assumption was back in the 1970s that, well, no, we're just going to have to move forward very quickly with alternative energy. I mean, Elon Musk and his cars. How many people can afford an $80,000 car? Not very many, right?
Right.
But, I was talking about coal. During the Second World War, the Germans managed to synthesize oil from coal. I mean, that was proved possible in the 1940s. But we're not doing that. And the way that the capitalist system works, and this seems to be a fatal flaw, is that it is more efficient to simply use oil until we exhaust the supply, or until the price becomes so high that it's unfeasible. But it's as if you have a ship that's heading for the rocks, and we have to change our course so we don't smash into the rocks. Yeah, but what about the pleasant journey we're going to have until we hit those rocks? Don't worry about the rocks. Something will come up. Something will come up so that we don't crash into the rocks.
I love the old saying, a fool and his money are soon parted. So I've noticed that throughout my life, and I have embodied that at times. In 1980, a friend of the family was offering 25% returns on investment because he was flipping homes. And so I invested all my savings with him, which was about $2,000 at the time. I was in 8th grade, and then interest rates shot up. The housing market went in the tank, and I think I had to wait 3 years to get my original investment back without any interest. I also, good friends of the family, very successful doctor, taken by a con man. So lost everything. So he was near 70 years of age, and he had to keep working because he had absolutely nothing. His lifetime of savings taken by a con man. Someone else close to my family, they bought a home, liked it, and then thought, oh, this other home's better, let's buy that one. And then interest rates shot up, and they were stuck paying mortgages for the 2 homes, unable to sell the first home or the second home, and had to rely on emergency loans from friends to make it through this crisis. So bad judgment can certainly compound these problems that you're talking about. Also, the more diverse the society, the more fraud, the less solidarity people feel for the entire nation, and you frequently have people who only feel a sense of loyalty for their group, and so they're willing to engage in predatory behavior against out groups, and so they hollow out the trust that has been built up over generations by the primary historic population of a country. You start letting in very savvy minorities, they feel no loyalty. Some of them feel no loyalty to the wider population. They just hollow out the social trust by running scams, taking advantage, and engaging in predatory behavior against outsiders. So many of the problems that you're talking about are caused by the destruction of cohesive, coherent, homogeneous nations. And also, I came of age during the time when the economy became sexy. So in 1980, I was 14, and I followed Reagan's thrilling, magnificent ride into office I started reading conservative publications. And then when the economy boomed in 1983, I read a great deal about the benefits of deregulation. I was a big Reagan supporter, and I noticed all these shows popping up on television, business news shows. I was fascinated by the GNP. I was fascinated by the gyrations of the stock market. I think it was in the 1980s that GNP growth became sexy, when the stock market became sexy, when business news became a hot entity, and people in all sorts of lives started talking about their stock holdings, where to invest, their mutual funds, their Fidelity Magellan Fund. I was in that for about a year and managed to pull 90% of it out before the great crash of, I think, 1988. But I think it was during the 1980s, am I right, Kevin, when the GNP became sexy, where the stock market became sexy, and you started getting expanded business coverage and economics coverage, and business news shows started popping up more on TV.
No, you're absolutely right about that. I think it's a very distressing phenomenon. The reason that, CNN led the way there. CNN started profiling all these rich guys. And, let's see the house. Let's see the garage with the 6 cars and all that stuff. It's just, inciting envy and greed. And then you had that show, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
Yeah.
With Robin Leach, Dana Carvey used to impersonate him on Saturday Night Live. I think it went something like this. I'm Robin Leach. I'm yelling, and I don't know why. But no, it just, again, this is, rich people, look at all the stuff that they have and the stuff that you don't have. I fail to see the utility and the morality of that. But, what you were talking about earlier, economic failures, so much of this, besides, people getting swindled, it has to do with the arrogance, and a particular type of arrogance. The idea being that we know what's going to happen in the future. As Schumacher writes, the future doesn't exist, so how can we know anything about it? He writes, all long-term forecasting is somewhat presumptuous and absurd. And he sums up, I thus come to the cheerful conclusion that life, including economic life, is still worth living because it is sufficiently unpredictable as to be interesting.
Right.
And, sorry, go ahead. No, you go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, the economy is uncertain. What is certain is that the quality of your relationships will help you ride through difficulties. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to, his book is called Small is Beautiful. And so it is not merely a critique of technocratic capitalism. It has some prescriptions as well. Now, he writes about something that's very important, and it's critical to the idea of small is beautiful. The first principle is called the principle of subsidiarity, or the principle of subsidiary function. A famous formulation of this principle reads as follows. It is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought, of its very nature, to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them. These sentences were meant for society as a whole, but they apply equally to the different levels within a large organization. The higher level must not absorb the functions of the lower one on the assumption that being higher, it will automatically be wiser and fulfill them more efficiency. Loyalty can grow only from the smaller units to the larger and higher ones, not the other way around. And loyalty is an essential demand in the health of any organization. The principle of subsidiary function implies that the burden of proof lies always on those who want to deprive a lower level of its function, and thereby of its freedom and responsibility in that respect. They have to prove that the lower level is incapable of fulfilling this function satisfactorily, and that the higher level can actually do much better. You know, what we've seen in the 20th century and the 21st century is pretty much a complete rejection of the subsidiary function because of the motto that bigger is better. That you see that, you know, to give you one example, I used to play Little League Baseball, and Little League Baseball teams were sponsored by local businesses. That you would, you'd get your uniforms for free, and they would, you know, you'd be wearing the livery of a hardware store or whatever. Well, then, you know, Walmart comes to town and all the hardware stores die out. And then you don't get the Little League Baseball teams anymore because Walmart is in the business of grinding down suppliers to give you the lowest prices possible. The fact that, you know, it becomes a problem to buy this stuff at Walmart because, you know, you don't have a job anymore because Walmart put you out of business. Well, that's not their concern. You know, Henry Ford famously gave his workers a revolutionary rise in salary to $5 a day. And apart from the other arguments of, you know, how this would lead to a better workforce, he reasoned that it would be very good for Ford, the Ford Motor Company, if his employees could actually afford to buy Ford cars.
Yeah.
Subsidiary principle is central to the to Catholic social teaching, and it's essential to the distributism, which was espoused by G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, and others. Schumacher, at the end of his book, he talks about collective ownership, which was he considered to be one way out of the mess that we were in. But this kind of collective ownership implies people deciding, you know, to do things not in the interests of efficiency. He talks about this company, Scott Bader. It's a chemical company, which has been involved with some pretty successful ventures with polymers, for example. I'll read the Wikipedia entry. Ernest Bader and his wife Doris Scott founded a chemical company, Scott Bader, and gave it to the employees under terms of common ownership, forming the Scott Bader Commonwealth in 1951. Scott Bader Limited was founded in 1921 with office premises in Finsbury Square, London, and moved to Wollaston, North Hampshire in 1943. It makes synthetic resins and composite materials. Since 1951, it has expanded. It is now international, employing around 600 people. Originally of Swiss nationality, Ernst Bader had been a conscientious objector in his home country. He was a Quaker, co-founder of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament of 100. Influential in Bader's thinkings were the Society of Friends, that's the Quakers, Gandhi, John Middleton Murray, and others. When he died in 1982, aged 91, at his home at Wollaston, Bader owned no personal business assets, private house, or car. Now you see, 600 employees is not very many. You know, one thinks of a chemical company, one thinks of companies like ICI, right? Which have what, tens of thousands of employees or hundreds of thousands of employees?
Right.
But a common objection to distributism has been the idea that, oh, we're all supposed to be chair makers or something. So dismissive of it on the basis that none of these operations could ever be successful or would ever be, you know, particularly useful to anyone. The idea behind, you know, the cooperative ownership, and of course, I don't know so much about this in the United States, but in many parts of Canada, you have the co-op. And the co-op will own grocery stores, gas stations, etc. In the Fraser Valley of Vancouver, just on the other side of the American border, there's quite a lot of co-op activity. There's a lot of co-op activity still is in Saskatchewan, to give another example. This idea of communal ownership, that one actually, not just a profit sharing, but in actually owning the company oneself. You see that, credit unions are another example of distributism. Do you have any thoughts on distributism, Luke?
Yeah, it's similar to my primary thoughts to Schumacher's whole book is which countries would one see as models superior to the current reigning neoliberal orthodoxy. For example, Schumacher was apparently inspired by Burma, but I don't think most people in the West would see Burma as a good example. So where are some countries that have organized things better that we could learn from? I'm just curious what you think. Which countries have an economic and social system that deals with these matters in a superior way to the West's reigning neoliberal orthodoxy?
Well, I would say that you're guilty of the fallacy of the excluded middle, because you're constantly presenting a false binary choice in which apparently you live in the Gordon Gekko world or you live in a mud hut. There's a middle ground between those two. And when what is establishing something new, it's impossible to point to models.
Well, that's the problem with communism, that it sounded beautiful in theory, but in practice it was absolute hell. So before one leaps off the diving board, I want to know where one is heading to. So I'd have to think there have been many different economic systems tried by many different peoples. I just want to see examples of what's better. Why can't we discuss examples of what's better?
I just gave you an example of something that's better. The Scott Bader Company.
No, I'm talking about countries.
No. Again, we all have to live the same way.
It has nothing to do with living the same way. What's the country?
You say country. There are many different people in countries. There are regions which are often different. There are different traditions, ways of doing things. You continually insist that these countries are monolithic.
I never said anything of the sort. I just asked for examples of countries that do things better than the reigning neoliberal orthodoxy.
No, but see, that question doesn't work, because it assumes that there are processes that are universal in these countries.
Well, you don't think, obviously we can learn from what other countries do. Japan, for example, rose from the ashes of World War II to create a monster economy. I think we can learn from the Japanese that they are a different way of organizing economic matters than the reigning neoliberal orthodoxy. So that's one example. South Korea is another example. China is another example. There are countries that do things differently from the West and have enjoyed success. I'm just wondering if you see them as examples. I don't know what's wrong with looking at a nation and seeing if there's something to be learned there that we should emulate.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do the people in Manhattan live the same way that the people in North Dakota do?
No.
Well, yeah, that's obvious. That was a rhetorical question. But the point is, okay, so the United States does it this way. Well, no, there are many different ways that people in the United States do things. So again, to point to any country and, to say, well, should that be the model or this be the model? It's just not, I think it's a category error. What Japan and South Korea taught us is that, contrary to what the neoliberal economists insist, that these private partnerships with government are often very successful, particularly for developing economies. Now, Hajun Chang in his book explains that neoliberalism seems to have been assimilated by the leaders of South Korea So they're moving away from that which made them so successful.
Right, and I think there's also a racial difference here. The economic system that's going to work for a conformist people like the Koreans or the Japanese is probably going to be different from a system that works for those of Northern European origins.
Again, there's degrees of conformance.
Right, but there's no way that Northern Europeans are ever going to be as conformist as the Koreans and the Japanese.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, Sweden has become pretty conformist to the point of pretty much attempting to abolish its own country. The way that things Sweden work, the way that things in Sweden work, as described by Roland Huntford in his book *The New Totalitarians*, is that the government gets together with business and the academy, and they decide what's going to happen. And this is it's given to the people as a fait accompli. I'll give you an example, one that Huntford cites in his book. That I guess it would be around 1970 that the Swedish corporatists decided that they needed more women in the workforce. How to do this? Well, you know, you can use various means of bribery or compulsion, but that's going to raise opposition. So one of the things they did was they made it unfashionable for women to stay at home and look after their children. And in Swedish, there was a word which was pretty much a exact analogy of the English word housewife. So they went so far as to coin a new word which meant the woman who stays at home. So I just mentioned that to illustrate that there is a high degree of social conformity in Sweden.
But seriously, you don't see a generalizable difference between proclivities to conformity in Japan, China, and Korea compared to Northern European peoples?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Germans, again, seem to have made this decision, or their leaders have made this decision, that there's no such thing as a German. And one would think that in a society that valued its autonomy, this would lead to revolution. Instead, there's a party which called the AfD, which I don't know, has over 10% of the support now in Germany. That indicates to me that the Germans will put up with practically anything, and that they're highly social conformist. You know, I know that, for instance, that I was reading this Englishman writing, I think he was for the London Spectator, that he got caught on a subway train, I believe it was, without a ticket, without a valid ticket. And he was offered counseling, free counseling for this. You know, there's a joke, which I may have made up myself, that you put up a sign, "Do not walk on the grass," or "Stay off the grass" in Germany. It's not simply that the Germans will obey the sign. More important is that they wouldn't even think of disobeying the sign. There's a sign, it's official, it says don't do this, so I won't do it. Now keep in mind that I am referring here only to Germans and not to Turks or Arabs.
Well, if you compare the literary, scientific, musical, philosophical accomplishments of the Germans and compare it with the Japanese, it would be about 100 to 1. I mean, as far as great classical music compositions, important philosophers, important writers, people who've made all sorts of inventions, the Germans are about 100 times as inventive as the Japanese. So
The Japanese
That's
have
what
a
I'm
very
referring
rich
to.
tradition in art, in visual art and literature. I know only a little. I mean, the Chinese literature reached its apogee a long, long time ago. You know, like over 1,000 years ago. The Japanese are rather different in that respect. So I'm not going to make any generalizations about the relative inferiority of Japanese culture.
Well, it's not so much inferiority, it's simply there's just a glaring difference between the creativity of European peoples and the creativity of Asians. Asians, by and large, don't make significant inventions. By and large, the Asians are afraid to stick out. They're afraid to vary from group consensus. That's what I mean by conformist. So almost all important inventions are inventions made by Westerners, meaning white people in the Western world. So the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese have their own strengths. They have higher average IQ than the IQ of the average white. They have a greater ability to sacrifice for the common good. They have a greater ability for cohesive action. It's not a matter of saying that the Asians are inferior to white Westerners. It's just that different peoples have different gifts, and the gifts of invention, the gifts of looking at the world in a new way and creating important literature or important classical music or important opera or important scientific developments or important medical technology developments. These are all primarily the product of the Faustian peoples of the West, not of Asians.
Yeah, but there's a problem with your argument, which is the very thing that Schumacher decries in his book, has led to the destruction of the bourgeoisie in the West. The Western peoples, middle-class Western peoples, bourgeois people, once placed a very high regard on art, that the radio networks were full of symphony performances. They had NBC had its own symphony. Toscanini conducted, that the television networks, when they started, they were full of classical music. And actually, Bishop Fulton Sheen had a show as well. But this relentless emphasis on efficiency has led to a situation where the artistic creativity of which you spoke is highly denigrated now. If you made the most beautiful movie in the world or in the history of the movies, there would be very little interest in it now, because did it make $1 billion? Did it gross $1.5 billion? Why were you supposed to be interested in anything which is not a blockbuster? You saw what Schumacher wrote about Charles Darwin in his book? This is quite telling. Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, wrote Charles Darwin in his autobiography, poetry of many kinds gave me great pleasure, and even as a schoolboy I took intense delight in Shakespeare, especially in the historical plays. I've also said that formerly pictures gave me considerable, and music very great delight. But now for many years I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I've tried lately to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. I have also lost any taste for pictures or music. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of fact. Now, I think that is quite telling. That here we had a man of culture who is boasting that now he has become a machine. He set himself to master efficiency in his own life, and he has mastered efficiency. Because, the question is, what good is Shakespeare? How does reading Shakespeare, reading the plays, or, watching a performance of them, in the theater or at the movies or on DVD. How does that make us better? Does it make us better in any way that can be measured? And the answer, of course, is no. The same goes for poetry. The same goes for serious music or art. They are now suspect under neoliberalism because, again, what good are they? How do they make us more efficient? How do they make us richer? I mean, in monetary terms.
Right. I did think what we're talking about, the diminished portion of the population that appreciates high culture. I think what we're primarily seeing is the result of dysgenic trends. The average IQ is dropping like a stone around the West, in large part because of immigration, but also because of dysgenic trends among white people. So as average IQ drops, you're going to have fewer people who simply have the cognitive capacity to appreciate high art. I can absolutely back up what Charles Darwin said. Until I started studying economics intensely, I loved poetry. I loved literature. When I studied economics intensely, it reworked my brain. And so I ceased to be able to appreciate poetry. So when you give yourself, particularly when you give yourself intensely and use almost all your cognitive powers, as Charles Darwin probably did to create his magnum opus on the origin of species, that's going to rewire your brain. You're going to form new neural pathways. You're going to make them very strong, and there are going to be positive results and negative results from that. So we wouldn't have on the origin of species if Darwin continued to appreciate poetry, Shakespeare, and paintings as much as he did. So we only have so much cognitive processing ability. I do not devote nearly as much time to my blog now that I've started doing so many live streams. So when we start excelling in one area, we're going to have to give something else up. The Vilna Gaon, a great rabbi from the 18th century, he would study Torah 18 hours a day. So he didn't spend a lot of time talking to his wife. He didn't spend a lot of time talking to his kids. When the great rabbis sometimes would go to weddings, they'd be studying Torah the whole time. They wouldn't be participating in the festivities. Other great rabbis didn't even know the names of their own children because they were so occupied in Torah that they weren't able to remember the names of their children.
This sounds deranged, Luke. This sounds absolutely deranged.
Okay, so let me finish my point. So okay. I know other people who've engaged in tremendous cognitive labors, and so as a result, they've had to struggle to recall the name of their kids. I mean, they can after 10, 15, 20 seconds, but they will go through different names for their child before your name is Peter or your name is Jack, because they've been so using their cognitive abilities in one abstract circle. So everything comes with a price. People who if you had a soccer ball, your brain gets joggled, and your ability for abstract thinking is reduced, often just on a temporary basis. But if you had enough soccer balls, you have enough concussions from playing soccer, you'll suffer permanent cognitive damage. Same with playing American football. So there are all sorts of choices that we make, and often excellence in one field results in poverty in other aspects of life.
Well, this idea that we can do one thing or the other, I don't really buy it. It used to be that a man who was considered to be a scholar, and Schumacher writes about this, was expected to know, a great amount about in many different fields. This intense specialization that we have now, it's fairly recent. The writer Joe Sobran was reputed to have pretty much memorized the whole of Shakespeare. Now, this isn't an exaggeration. That is reported that many people would ask him about, you know, such and such a Shakespeare play and this character, and he would start, you know, reeling off line after line after line after line. Joe Sobran wrote a book about Shakespeare, Alias Shakespeare, which takes the Oxfordian position that Shakespeare was not, in fact, the author of the plays, but Joe Sobran was learned and interesting on a whole host of other subjects. Just want to continue from Schumacher here, following from the Darwin's autobiography. He writes that this impoverishment, so movingly described by Darwin, will overwhelm our entire civilization if we permit the current tendencies to continue, what Etienne Gilson calls the extension of positive science to social facts. All divergent problems can be turned into convergent problems by a process of rejection. The result, however, is the loss of all higher forces to ennoble human life. And, you know, it's going back to what I was saying now. It's not that long ago that that normies would, you know, subscribe to Time magazine, and, you know, they would buy Reader's Digest and get the Reader's Digest condensed books. And they would, you know, look and see, oh, what are the bestsellers? You know, what are the fiction bestsellers? You know, I should make sure to buy a few of them every year so that I can keep myself au courant with the culture. That world has vanished. It has completely disappeared. And for the vast majority of normies now, middle-class normies, the bourgeois, if you will, art, if it doesn't involve conspicuous consumption and showing off, is for faggots and weirdos.
Yeah, we've had rabbis who've reputedly memorized the entire Talmud, which is approximately 7,000 folio pages. That means folio page is two-sided. So, for example, the Talmud is so enormous that if a collection of the Talmud fell on you, you'd die. So there have been rabbis capable of great cognitive skills, but I'm sure that came with a tremendous loss in other areas. I'm sure that generally speaking, they weren't the most social. They probably didn't have a wide knowledge of the sciences and of history and of geography. We used to have much more of a general education. And as you know, that's been lost. And I'm trying to think, what is the reason for that? I know, comparing the Australian English system to the American, that in Australia, you don't waste nearly as much time in high school. High school is much more intense. That's also true in Europe and England and Germany compared to the United States. And so in England, Australia, and Germany, you just go straight into your area of specialty. So at age 18, you'll start studying medicine, or you'll start studying law, or you'll start studying dentistry. You won't have to do an undergraduate degree. My father noticed a dramatic change in the quality of students when he started teaching in America compared to Australia. He had to reduce his homework assignments to about 1/2 or 1/3 of what he used to assign people in Australia. So I think part of that is that in Australia and England, only an elite would go on to tertiary education, while in America it'd be about 50% of the population goes on to some type of tertiary education. But yeah, we've lost that middle class aspirational culture where people would want to improve themselves by reading the great books, by subscribing to classical music concerts, by going to the opera. And I think a great deal of it has to do with the destruction of the racial cohesion of Western countries.
That's part of it. That's part of it. Multiculturalism is a big part of it as well, because multiculturalism constantly seeks the lowest common denominator, you know, of things that people can agree with. Art is highly problematic in multicultural societies because the newcomers will not be in any position to appreciate it, let alone they typically come from countries where a very low value is placed on art, or Western style art, at any rate.
And
Sorry, go ahead.
And secularism, like secularism diminishes the soul. So a religious West is much more likely to yearn for the transcendent.
Now, Schumacher devotes a whole chapter to education and what he sees as a crisis in education. And I think this was very prescient as well, because now we have this situation where, I don't know, 70% of Americans go on to post-secondary education. It is just, how much, what, $1 trillion in debt or some such thing. And then they get their degrees finally and they end up working as baristas. Not that I think that the point of education, as it's traditionally understood, is to train people for specific educations, unless you're talking about that kind of education. At a time when, Oxford and Cambridge had a few thousand students between them, there was not an assumption that these people were there, to learn, to fit into certain jobs. They were being educated. The university started as to train priests, and then later their role became to train the people who ran the empire. And later they didn't have a role. Schumacher writes, "The scientists never tire of telling us that the fruits of their labors are neutral. Whether they enrich humanity or destroy it depends on how they are used. And who is to decide how they are used? There is nothing in the training of scientists and engineers to enable them to take such decisions, or else what becomes in the neutrality of science? If so much reliance is today being placed in the power of education to enable ordinary people to cope with the problems thrown up by scientific and technological progress, then there must be something more to education than Lord Snow suggests. Science and engineering produce know-how, but know-how is nothing by itself. It is a means without an end, a mere potentiality, an unfinished sentence. Know-how is no more a culture than a piano is music." But of course, this secularization and the rise of scientism has led to a situation where it's just now assumed that there's no such thing as culture, or that culture can in no way be defined, or that some young fellow with dreadlocks rapping about bitches, and his Daimler or whatever. Well, obviously that's as good as the Threepenny Opera or a Schubert song, because who are we to make judgments?
I came to the United States. I was born in 1966, and I entered school late in second grade at age 8. But starting about age 9, I noticed every year pretty much in my schooling, there was a new educational fad blowing through. Like there was this whole new approach. And from what I've seen, virtually every educational fad has been worthless. And we waste so much time in education trying to teach critical thinking. And you can't teach critical thinking. You've either got it or you don't. I much prefer the traditional teaching of facts and the basics of history, reading, writing, and arithmetic and science. So as I was going through schooling in the 70s and the 80s, just like it seems like every year there's a new educational fad blowing through, primarily propagated by women. And it was just so useless. And I also noticed coming to the United States in 1977, where I entered 6th grade, is that a lot of classroom time would be given to watching videos, documentaries or movies or whatever they're on video. We didn't have that in Australia, but even up through college, some of my college professors, if they were having a tough day, they'd just like, okay, I want you guys to watch this documentary, and they'd walk out and we'd just be sitting there watching a documentary. So a great deal of America's educational resources, it seems to me, have been wasted to fads, to trying to teach things that can't be taught, such as critical thinking, and to watching videos.
You know, if I were a dictator, every education faculty in the West would be destroyed, and the ground would be salted such that nothing could ever grow there again. And this devastation would stand as a terrible warning and a reminder of what happens when you give so-called experts too much power. I mean, in my own lifetime, something remarkable was achieved in Canada. You have people living over 4,000 miles in one direction, and people who come, most of them came from the British Isles, but we had all of these people circa 1900 in the first decades of the 20th century coming from Ukraine and such places. And we had achieved pretty much a 100% literacy rate. And English, pretty much everyone who started school in grade 1, there was no kindergarten, they knew how to read by Christmas. And it was taught using a system called phonics. That is to say, you sound out the words, either out loud or in your head. That, it's symbolic, right? And then the evil people who run the education faculties decided that no, we're not content with a 100% success rate. And there are various problems with phonics because reasons. So they came up with this method called look-say, which is supposed to be more natural. And what look-say is essentially children are taught to guess at words, with the result that functional illiteracy, which was pretty much unknown in my country and pretty much unknown amongst the white population of the United States, has exploded in recent decades. Similarly, you had a very high level of achievement in arithmetic, certainly basic arithmetic. Everyone knew it, or close to everyone knew it. And then, okay, we're going to have this idea called the new math, where we're not simply going to teach you facts or, we're going to teach you rules, theories, or you're going to have to understand all the ideas behind that. No, 5 times 5 is 25. I don't need to understand any more than that. And so, mathematics, and apparently there's even crazier ideas that have come out since then, with the result that a large number of our young people are functionally illiterate and are incapable of simple arithmetic. But we're told that, since everyone has a, calculator on his or her smartphone, that's not a problem. So going back to as I say, if I had the power, I would physically destroy every education faculty in my country and scatter its inhabitants to the ends of the earth.
And who primarily staffs educational faculty? It's women. Who are the people primarily pushing these destructive changes? I'm sure that you mentioned, I'm sure it's primarily women. With very few exceptions, I would not allow women to be in charge of anything in education, because when women have power, what they do is they form covens and cliques. And they just stifle thought, and they just destroy institutions. They destroy objective standards of excellence. They wage war on competition. Things become more about their feelings, and it's just an absolute disaster. You cannot allow women to take charge of education after after first grade.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Coven, because one of the most wicked institutions in my country of Canada is called the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, which is commonly referred to by its acronym pronounced OICE. And the Premier of Ontario before the recent election was a woman called Kathleen Wynne, who was one of these lesbians, became a lesbian in later life. And if you look at a picture of this woman, she looks like what I just pulled up her Wikipedia page and I physically started. It made me jump back that she looks like what Hansel and Gretel found inside the gingerbread house. And she was a big deal in OICE before she got involved in politics.
Right, when women take over an institution, they form covens, and lesbians, because they have more testosterone than other women, basically push their way to the top. It's what's happened with all the UC chancellors who are lesbians here in California. They've all formed some lesbian clique. One leading member of the clique, a chancellor, jumped off a building committing suicide after a tiff with her lover. They frequently loot the public purse. They're just a disaster. So I'm essentially for the removal of women from all positions of leadership in virtually all institutions. I mean, women have been a disaster for politics, for education, for the media, for the academy, for the law, for social work. I mean, this is not in any sense to say that women are inferior to men. It's just that different peoples have different gifts. Men and women have different gifts. And when you allow women to take leadership roles in institutions that were created by men, they inevitably start undermining and destroying them. So allow women to flourish in the spheres of life that they are suited for. Allow men to flourish in the spheres of life that they are suited for. Allow the Japanese to flourish in their spheres of life, and Jews in their spheres, and white people in their spheres, and blacks in their spheres. Like, different peoples have different gifts, and we shouldn't expect everybody to just be equally qualified.
As we're winding down this show, I thought that I would refer to a couple of threads, internet threads, which had influenced me a great deal. That Schumacher can be seen as the father of anti-scale. But where I first was acquainted with this idea as an integrated philosophy was from the website NPC and from its administrator, who calls himself Pleasure Man. He started a thread in March 2010 called The Limits of Human Scale. And I'll just read a little bit, a very small bit from the beginning. Our society is seriously out of scale. This fact has produced a range of dysfunctional behaviors that we have incorporated into our behavioral framework, creating further imbalance. The end result will be atomization, depopulation, and social chaos. The only remedy for this problem long-term is reduction in scale, achieved by reorganizing nations into manageable and relatively homogeneous populations, population and immigration control, and restraint of technological, economic, and social policies which give rise to problems of scale. This remedy is not, I must stress, a devolution. It is not a reversion to the past, much less an idealized past free from worry. In any composition of society, there will be tension between traditional and progressive outlooks. There will be complacency and conflict and all the usual human evils. Nor is the primary concern Malthusian, that is to say, an unsustainable growth in resource consumption. While this is a problem we face as a result of scale, it is not my focus here. There are two threads, the main Limits of Human Scale thread, which is quite lengthy, 19 pages long, and there's another one that's more of a philosophical discussion. There's a particular one as the scale spins, anecdotes of consolidation, gigantitude, and centralization, which is 30 pages. I can recommend these very highly. I will make my traditional warning, which they mock me for at MPC, that the site is often scabrous, and it is scabrous on purpose. So, caveat lector, as they say.
And I put one of the threads in the video description, and I can add the other one if you send me the link.
Yeah, sure. I'll just point out that there's a picture much reproduced around the web of Mitt Romney at a whiteboard, and he has written out scale, size, atomization, size, complexity, atomization, liberalism, elitism. This photograph is a mock-up, just in case, don't get shocked if you see that picture. It's a joke. It's not for real. It would be greatly pleasing if Mitt Romney were interested in the problem of scale, but he's very much a neoliberal who made his fortune by sucking companies dry at Bain Capital.
Okay, I'm done on my end, so I'll turn it back to you for any final words.
Okay, well, why don't you tell us about the book that we're discussing next week?
John Mearsheimer, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, perhaps the most important book in political science in the last 70 years. It's a realist approach to conflicts of interest between nations. And if it's not an easy book to get through. So if you don't want to struggle, if you don't want to do the hard work, people can just find any of numerous Mearsheimer lectures on YouTube, such as Can China Rise Peacefully? And there, in about 10 minutes, you'll get an admirable, pithy, and compelling summary of this book. Mearsheimer has got another book coming out about the weaknesses in the liberal global worldview. Mearsheimer has many interesting lectures on YouTube. He also published with Stephen Walt an important book called The Israel Lobby, which came out in 2006. Mearsheimer is an Anglo-Saxon. He's part of the Anglo-Saxon realist approach to foreign policy. He had his career damaged because he dared to name the Israel Lobby. He's a formidable political scientist at the University of Chicago. He has a long and respect-worthy history of publications and just numerous fascinating lectures easily accessible on YouTube. But if one is willing to do the hard work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, I can't think of any book on political science in the last 50 years which is more important.
Now, my final statement will be this. Some people have asked me whether they could get more warning than a week for what the next book of the week is going to be on the book club. So the week after Mearsheimer, the book will be the first novel that we've considered, which is called Loitering with Intent by Muriel Spark, published in 1981. It comes in at an economical 224 pages and is delightful to read. And it's the story of an artist's life. It is a book about many, among other things, it's about writing a novel.
Okay, I'll look forward to it. And you can find Kevin Michael Grace on Twitter at KMG Victoria. And that's it for now, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.